Hey guys, tonight we're wandering down the misty, gaslit streets of Victorian England. Not in a horse-drawn carriage, not in a murder mystery, but in search of sleep. You're clutching a too-thin shawl, your boots are damp from fog, and there's a distant click-clack of hooves as a constable strolls by, unconcerned by your bleary eyes. You haven't slept in days, and the list of available cures includes boiled lettuce, tinctures of opium, and walking in ovals around Hyde Park until your legs give up. Sounds relaxing already, right? You're not alone, of course. Sleeplessness in the 1800s is quietly rampant, yet not something people really admit out loud. The soft glow of gas lamps filters through lace curtains, casting shadows across heavy wallpaper and ticking clocks that mock you with their rhythm. And yet, somehow, you're expected to greet the morning with moral clarity, a clear conscience, and hopefully not collapse during your fourth cup of tea. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm building a little world for sleepy minds, and your support helps it grow. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone is drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past the soot-streaked facades of late 19th century London, somewhere between respectable Mayfair and the vaguely suspicious parts of Bloomsbury. It's a little after midnight. You know this not from a watch, which you can't afford, but from the haunting sound of Big Ben floating through the chill air like a sluggish metronome. Your footsteps echo on the damp cobblestones, soft but persistent, much like your insomnia. The streets aren't empty. There are always people awake at this hour. Carriage drivers, milkmen, scholars, constables, and others with more mysterious occupations. You pass a bakery's side window and catch the smell of rising bread, a warm puff of comfort that reminds you, inconveniently, that you are wide awake and starving. Gas lamps hiss overhead, casting halos of yellow fog around you. The night feels eternal here, thick, enveloping, and very Victorian. There's something oddly cozy about the misery of it all, like everyone's collectively giving up on a good night's sleep and pretending this is normal. But sleep, in your time, isn't merely elusive. It's a matter of character. In 1883, the Times of London published a scathing editorial suggesting that people who couldn't sleep were likely suffering from a guilty conscience. And if not that, then perhaps indigestion caused by reading improper novels or eating foreign food like spaghetti. Yes, even the pasta was blamed. Sleep was seen not as a biological necessity, but as a sign of moral equilibrium. You sleep well? Congratulations, you're a person of discipline and decency. You lie awake tossing in bed? Time to re-examine your soul. The truth, though, is much more mundane. The Industrial Revolution had flung Britain into an entirely new rhythm. Factories didn't sleep, train schedules ticked like clockwork, and the artificial glow of gaslight had extended the workday far beyond what your circadian rhythms ever signed up for. And while your employer might appreciate your late-night productivity, your nervous system is quietly filing for emotional bankruptcy. You glance at the window of a chemist's shop, its display glimmering with hopeful solutions. Tiny brown bottles with elaborate cursive labels, soothing elixir, tincture of peace, nighttime draft. They promise everything. They deliver, mostly addiction. But that's for a later stroll. Tonight, you're just part of a much larger trend. Victorians were exhausted. Their diaries, novels, and medical journals are riddled with desperate tales of sleeplessness. Charles Dickens himself walked up to 20 miles a night, trying to tire himself into sleep. 20 miles. That's not a sleep strategy. It's a half marathon. Historians still argue whether Dickens suffered from classic insomnia or a neurotic guilt complex with very strong calves. Either way, he wasn't alone. Letters between upper-class women routinely mention the usual wakefulness, or that blasted ceiling again, and everyone from doctors to poets seem to be quietly melting down after dark. So as you shuffle onward, you pass open windows with flickering candlelight and smell faint traces of lavender oil and chamomile tea, early attempts to calm the nerves. You note a discarded leaflet near a lamppost. Dr. Bellwether's 8 Rules for Restful Slumber. It includes gems like avoid hysteria, do not read poetry after dusk, and the always popular marry early and avoid Frenchmen. You step over it. No help there. What's funny is, even the medical experts of the day were at odds. Some insisted insomnia was a digestive problem, others blamed the heart, the spine, or, classic cop-out, the moon. Physicians offered everything from mustard plasters to lead-lined mattresses, and if those failed, they prescribed emigration. Yes, emigration. Try sleeping in Australia. One doctor wrote in 1871, "The air there is fortifying." Historians still argue whether he genuinely meant this as medical advice or just wanted fewer patients. Tonight, though, your goal is simpler. You're just trying to walk your eyes heavy. Maybe the rhythm will help. Maybe the cold will numb you into a dream. Maybe your landlady's boiled cabbage will take effect, though you doubt it. Either way, you keep moving, lost among the flickering lights, the low fog, and the collective sleeplessness of a city that hums softly through the night. That's a moral failing. At least that's the prevailing theory of the age, one whispered behind lace fans at dinner parties and scrawled in bold editorial fonts across columns of Victorian broadsheets. You're not merely tired in this society, you are, in a sense, failing to be virtuous. Lying awake at night? That must mean you've strayed somehow, from moral purity, from self-discipline, or from the church, possibly all three. The logic, if you can call it that, is as sleep-deprived as you are. In the upright posture of the Victorian moral code, insomnia isn't just a condition, it's a sign of inner corruption. The mind, they believe, must be clean to rest. So if you're up pacing at 2 a.m., it couldn't possibly be because your mattress is stuffed with barley husks and regret. It must be because your conscience is a mess. You pass by an open-air bookstall illuminated by flickering gaslight, and your eye catches one particularly judgmental title, The Restful Spirit, A Treatise on Sleep and Sin by Reverend Augustus Flake. A real book, by the way, real name, Augustus Flake. Historians still argue whether he was sincere or just really committed to satire. Inside that treatise, a gem of a paragraph that blames the modern trend of thought for preventing proper rest. Yes, thought itself. If you think too much, you will never sleep again. So the next time your mind is racing with tomorrow's worries, just remember, it's not anxiety. You're simply failing to repress your immoral thoughts properly. Tuck that in with you tonight. And then, there's the Calvinists. You see, among certain circles, especially in the stricter Protestant sects, rest was something you earned, not something you were entitled to. A good night's sleep wasn't a medical baseline. It was a spiritual reward for living righteously. That little snooze you caught after church? Divine approval. The 5-hour stare into the abyss you had after reading Wuthering Heights? Definitely your fault. Even children weren't exempt. Manuals for proper child rearing recommended withholding bedtime as punishment. Imagine being 6 years old, having spilled your milk, and then being told that your path to redemption begins with staring at a gas lamp until sunrise. Sleep was a carrot, and oh, what a droopy, judgmental carrot it was. Of course, the wealthier classes had their own unique flavor of judgment. In drawing rooms lined with mahogany and hushed tones, ladies with too tight corsets would discuss how improper digestion, or too many continental habits, i.e. anything vaguely French, could result in a restless spirit. A single midnight snack might doom you to weeks of insomnia. Also, don't eat cheese after 5 o'clock. Why? Because the Duke of Bletchley said so, and he once met Florence Nightingale. Speaking of Florence Nightingale, yes, the legendary nurse, she too had ideas about insomnia. In her influential book, Notes on Nursing, she spoke of the importance of fresh air, a quiet room, and regularity. Sounds good, right? Except this advice came with a subtle, judgmental sting. If you needed more than those things, perhaps you were weak. Real health, she implied, produces real sleep. If you're tossing and turning, then clearly something deeper is broken, probably your moral backbone. Now you're thinking, wasn't anyone sympathetic? Well, sort of. A few progressive physicians started to note that maybe, just maybe, sleep was a physiological process. But their voices were drowned out by the louder ones insisting that sleeplessness came from excessive reading, overindulgence in tea, or, and this is real, from the use of trousers that fit too snugly around the loins. Historians still argue whether that last one was metaphorical or just another Victorian way of saying, it's the pants' fault. As you stroll now, past yet another lamplit square and a stray newspaper swirling in the wind, You catch snippets of conversation from a pair of gentlemen walking ahead of you. They're debating loudly whether insomnia is caused by impure thoughts or impure water. You're not sure which you find more disturbing, the debate or the fact that neither of them seems to know how to use an indoor voice. You slow down to avoid being part of a surprise moral symposium. In quieter corners, the poor don't bother pretending their insomnia has metaphysical roots. They're too busy being cold. Cramped tenements, unpredictable shifts at factories, and the occasional rats playing midnight tag make restful sleep more of a myth than a reality. And yet, even they are judged for it. Laziness and sleeplessness are intertwined in the minds of the upper class, despite no evidence that the two have anything in common. You step into a side alley now, out of curiosity, and find a small sign tacked to a crooked doorframe. Guaranteed sleep in 1 hour or less, spiritual harmonization inside. Inside is likely a self-declared mesmerist with a swinging watch and a waxy mustache, offering vague affirmations and maybe a scented kerchief. Or, if you're lucky, a warm chair. If only it were that simple. But in this time, no cure is free from judgment. If you use a tonic to sleep, you're weak. If you don't use one, you're indulgent. If you sleep too much, you're lazy. Too little, you're unclean. If you're a woman, it's your uterus. If you're a man, it's probably something you read in the paper. Everyone's guessing, and no one's sleeping. The strange part? Despite all the shame, the problem was clearly widespread. Doctors were writing books. Philosophers were issuing lectures, clergy were sermonizing from pulpits, and still the gas lamps kept burning and the sleepless kept walking. You sigh, draw your coat closer, and make a mental note not to feel guilty tonight if sleep doesn't come. After all, if Victorian society can't decide whether you're sinful or simply oversnacked, maybe, just maybe, it's okay to just be tired. The lettuce. Let's talk about the lettuce. You find yourself standing outside an open-air market just beginning to pack up for the night. Crates of limp cabbage and dented apples are being swept aside, but one stall is still open, its lantern casting a sleepy halo over a modest pile of lettuce. Just plain, unimpressive lettuce. Butterhead by the looks of it, though you're not exactly a botanist. And yet, in Victorian England, this floppy leaf was a legitimate sleep aid. Yes, lettuce. Doctors swore by it. Grandmothers whispered about it. Pamphlets promised miracles in leaf form. The idea was simple. Boil the lettuce into a thin soup or steep its leaves into a tea, then drink the lukewarm, slightly bitter concoction about an hour before bed. If it didn't knock you out, at least you'd be too annoyed by the flavor to stay awake. You probably didn't expect the world's greatest empire to rest its sleepy hopes on salad. But here we are. The sleep lettuce theory actually dates back centuries, with even Roman writers mentioning the plant's calming effects. But Victorians took it to a new level. In 1861, the Household Almanac of Gentle Remedies described lettuce tea as an efficacious sedative against the restlessness brought on by excessive piano playing and poor digestion, which, to be fair, probably describes 70% of Victorian insomniacs. Historians still argue whether the sedative effect came from actual compounds in the lettuce, like lactucarium, a mild white sap that oozes out when the stems are cut, or simply from the placebo effect of drinking something that tastes vaguely like wet wallpaper. Either way, the lettuce cure caught on. In upper-class households, you might have your lettuce boiled in cream and garnished with nutmeg. In humbler kitchens, it was just water and greens, left to steep until the whole house smelled like a tired rabbit's dream. There were even sleep salads served cold, dressed lightly with vinegar and eaten in silence. One medical pamphlet recommended chewing slowly and thinking of still ponds and gently falling rain as you swallowed. Chewing was medicine now. You wander through the market, eyes drifting across a faded sign. Dr. Prendergast's Sleep Lettuce Elixir, now with caraway. Aha! Another upgrade. By the 1880s, sleep tonics with lettuce extract were all the rage. These were usually sold by enthusiastic apothecaries wearing pocket watches and questionable facial hair. They'd bottle the stuff in little green vials, slap on labels like Nocturne Drops or Mrs. Beeton's Dream Aid, and sell it to anyone with 6 pence and a sleep-deprived look in their eye. Was it effective? Mildly. Maybe. For a few, it might have helped. For others, it simply gave them a new thing to blame when they were still wide-eyed at 3 a.m. You slip one hand into your coat pocket and feel the little note a friend gave you earlier. Try the lettuce. Scribbled beneath it is an address, a sleepy apothecary known to brew fresh decoctions nightly. Curious now, you take a turn toward Soho, weaving past shivering cats and silent houses, all the while contemplating your upcoming flirtation with leafy greens. As you walk, you pass a row of tall townhouses, their windows shuttered tight. One has a flicker of movement behind a lace curtain. A woman, middle-aged, reading by candlelight, likely with a pot of lettuce water nearby. You imagine her sipping it slowly, convincing herself it tastes better with every passing page. Her husband snores obliviously in the next room. She sighs, folds her book, and waits for sleep, or at least for dawn. There's something almost poetic about how seriously Victorians took their lettuce. The same people who believed demons might ride your chest at night were willing to trust in the calming powers of salad. Perhaps that's what makes it endearing. It wasn't about science exactly. It was about hope. The idea that something gentle, natural, and green could ease the chaos of the brain and coax the body towards stillness. You pass a poster pinned to a public notice board, free public lecture, The Sedative Virtues of the Humble Lettuce, presented by Lord Bixby and his valet. Of course, Lord Bixby, known for his chronic sleep issues and suspicious fondness for herbal infusions. You've heard of him before, possibly from a scandal involving 3 jars of peppermint oil and a runaway donkey, but that's a story for another night. Your stomach rumbles. Lettuce tea doesn't exactly scream satisfying, but it's better than nothing. You wonder if anyone ever tried mixing it with something more potent, say laudanum, but that's a dangerous spiral you'll save for a future stroll. The street's quiet as you near the apothecary. A little bell above the door chimes as you step inside. The air smells of dried herbs, faint lemon peel, and something you can only describe as unwashed mortar and pestle. Shelves line the walls, packed with dusty bottles and handwritten labels. A sleepy man in wire-framed spectacles peers up from behind the counter, mid-yawn. You show him your note. "Ah," he says, rubbing his eyes. "The lettuce order." He disappears into the back and returns with a small corked vial, slightly warm to the touch. "Steep it," he instructs. "Don't boil. Say a prayer if you like. It can't hurt." You nod, thank him, and step back into the foggy quiet. Your precious cargo nestled in your pocket, you resume your walk, still very much awake, but now armed with something green, bitter, and weirdly respectable. The lettuce may not knock you out, but maybe it's the ritual. The warm cup, the soft focus, the brief illusion of control. For a people obsessed with discipline and order, perhaps that's all the comfort they really needed. You take a few more turns down quieter and quieter streets, the night settling thickly around you like a wool blanket slightly damp from London fog. Your footsteps echo against cobblestones slick with rain, and you can't help but think, it's no wonder people couldn't sleep here. Between the gaslight flicker, the wet chill drafts, and the omnipresent sense that something was probably watching you from behind a coal chute, insomnia was practically a civic duty. Still, some Victorians had a plan for that. A very long plan. You see, when lettuce water failed, and oh, it often did, the next prescription on the docket wasn't a stronger herb or an adjustment to your diet. No, it was walking. Just more walking. Not a brisk jog, not a pleasant afternoon constitutional, but a long, slow, meditative trudge through the city's gloomiest corners. At midnight, in silence. This was the era of the insomnia walk. You pass by a man in a tailored coat doing exactly that. Hat pulled low, hands clasped behind his back, eyes forward in a 1,000-yard stare. He's not lost. He's treating himself. Doctors like Sir James Crichton Browne and Dr. Thomas Laycock recommended nocturnal perambulations as a method for aligning the body's rhythm with the natural fatigue cycle. Basically, walk until you're too tired to stay awake, then collapse into bed like a Victorian fainting couch. There were rules, of course, because this is still the 1800s, and heaven forbid someone go unsupervised in their own therapy. One London guidebook suggested that insomnia walks should begin exactly 1 hour after dinner, involve no conversation, and take place only in respectably lit, morally sound districts, which rules out half of Soho and definitely Whitechapel. Also, if you're a woman, you're advised to bring a chaperone, preferably one with a fainting fan and a tendency to pretend not to notice social scandal. Historians still argue whether these walks were genuinely medicinal or simply a polite excuse to get out of earshot from one's snoring spouse. Either way, by the 1870s, entire pamphlets were devoted to insomnia walking routes, complete with recommended benches for rest and moral reflection. You imagine Victorians pausing on these benches to muse deeply about existence, or possibly to tie their shoes for the 6th time just to kill another 2 minutes. You take a left down an alley lined with peeling posters and the occasional cat-shaped shadow. The rhythmic crunch of your boots against gravel creates a strange sort of lullaby. And maybe that's the point. No distractions, no conversation, just the sound of yourself being alive in a quiet place. It's either deeply calming or vaguely existential, depending on your blood sugar. In elite homes, walking could even be done indoors. Wealthy households had carpeted galleries or circular hallways, built specifically so that one could pace under candlelight while wearing velvet slippers and a robe that implied both wisdom and mild digestive upset. There were even devices called perambulatory trainers, which were basically indoor treadmills for gentlemen too refined to go outside. You wonder what those men would think of your current alleyway. Probably declare it invigoratingly humble. Not to be outdone, some aristocrats hired personal walking companions. That's right, people paid other people to walk silently beside them at night, occasionally handing them lemon water and nodding gravelly at the moon. You briefly consider this as a career pivot. Professional loiterer has a certain Victorian ring to it. You turn a corner and spot an old church clock, its hands stuck permanently at 4:12. It's been broken for months, maybe years, but locals still glance at it anyway, as if hoping the past has something to offer the present. You sit down on the worn stone step beneath it, not to pray, but just to be still. The walking has done its job. Your legs ache, your eyelids feel heavier, and your thoughts no longer march in anxious formation. They wander now, soft and aimless. A breeze drifts past, carrying the faint scent of coal smoke, wet bark, and someone's very ambitious cologne. You imagine the dozens of others like you right now, wandering the streets for the sake of sleep. A secret society of nightwalkers in wool cloaks and ankle boots, all hoping that just one more block, one more lamplit corner, will be the one that finally convinces the body to rest. Of course, not everyone was supportive of the practice. Some clergymen warned that walking late at night led to wandering thoughts, which sounds suspiciously like Victorian code for you might see something fun. Others feared that moonlit walking promoted melancholic brooding. And to be fair, if you've ever heard someone describe their insomnia as a velvet storm inside my brain, you know they might have a point. But for those desperate enough, the rules didn't matter. A walk was free. It didn't require boiling anything or writing down your dreams or getting judged by a pharmacist with a waxed mustache. You could simply open the door and move. That in itself felt like hope. The church bell rings, once dully, more out of habit than conviction. You rise, dust yourself off, and resume your slow journey. Somewhere between the lettuce and the lamplight, a kind of quiet forms. Not sleep, not yet, but stillness. And that's worth walking for. You step off the curb and back into motion. The cobblestones beneath your feet seem to soften with every stride, as if the night itself is growing weary right alongside you. But you're not done yet, not even close. Because if lettuce tea and long walks failed to do the trick, the Victorians had one last resort: laudanum. Yes, the crown jewel of 19th century insomnia cures. A tiny bottle, a few shimmering drops, and the sleep of 1,000 regrets. You're not far from Fleet Street now, and as you pass the shadow of an old apothecary shop with blacked-out windows, you can practically hear the clink of bottles behind the counter. In the 1800s, every chemist's shelf was stocked with it, a reddish-brown liquid, sticky and bitter, usually sold in little cork-stoppered vials that looked more like perfume than medicine. But oh, what a kick they packed. Laudanum was a blend of alcohol and opium, brewed together in a mix that could lull the nerves, relax the muscles, and, if you weren't careful, stop your breathing entirely. It was the Victorian version of just take something and hope for the best. Doctors prescribed it like candy, for coughs, for hysteria, for nervous afflictions, and most especially for the sleepless melancholia of the intellectually burdened, which is a really poetic way to say writers who can't shut off their brains. You pass a small reading club still lit on the second floor of a bookshop. Through the window, a woman in a shawl sits over a notebook, brow furrowed. Maybe she's a poet. Maybe she's a diary keeper. Maybe she's just counting how many drops of laudanum it'll take before her thoughts stop composing Shakespearean sonnets at 3 a.m. Historians still argue whether laudanum was a miracle or a mistake. Some claim it saved lives by calming dangerously anxious minds. Others say it created a society of beautifully dressed, quietly addicted zombies. Probably both. It was fashionable, too. Lord Byron took it. So did Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And not to be outdone, so did the dog of one prominent socialite, who was reportedly given half a teaspoon a night to keep it from barking during dinner parties. Even the pets couldn't escape the trend. But the thing with laudanum is, it worked. Sort of. You'd take your dose, 10 drops in a spoonful of sherry, say, and drift into something like sleep. Not restful sleep, not dream-rich, snore-worthy slumber, but a blankness, a pause, like your brain took a quick vacation to lie on a fainting couch of its own. Of course, there were side effects. Vivid dreams, for one, some pleasant, some strange, and some you'd rather not talk about in daylight. Also, addiction, constipation, a tendency to write tragic letters in the middle of the night. One user described it as sleeping in velvet chains. You wouldn't dream exactly. You'd just fall into a warm hole and not climb out until someone opened the curtains. You pause at a quiet corner where two streets meet like a whispered argument. A rat scurries past, and somewhere above, a piano plinks a lazy scale. Probably someone in the early stages of insomnia, trying to soothe themselves with Chopin. You bet they've got a vial of laudanum tucked into the folds of their dressing gown, just in case the arpeggios don't work. There's a reason Victorian novels are full of characters who sigh dramatically and retire with a draught. It wasn't wine. It was laudanum, often dosed by housemaids or concerned aunties, and it was perfectly normal. In fact, if you weren't sipping it, you might be seen as a bit uncouth. A raw-nerved mess in a world that prized composure above all else. You turn another corner and spot what might be a dispensary, or maybe just a very well-labeled wine shop. Either way, the bottles glint invitingly in the low light. You imagine walking in, asking for something for the nerves, and being handed a tiny glass bottle with a neat handwritten label. Maybe Dr. Penworthy's Midnight Elixir, or Widow Green's Night Drops. You'd tuck it into your pocket like a charm, or a weapon. Not everyone took it so lightly, of course. Some people resisted. Some refused to take anything stronger than chamomile tea. And some, usually those who could afford doctors who actually read medical journals, were wary of the drug's dark edge. Queen Victoria herself used laudanum during childbirth, but even her physicians debated its long-term effects. Not that anyone dared bring it up at dinner. You stroll past a wrought iron fence trailing ivy and moss. Your breath fogs in the air now, and your steps grow slower. Not tired, exactly, just thoughtful. The kind of thoughtful that comes when you know the world is asleep, but your mind isn't done talking yet. Laudanum had a way of making people quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet. It didn't solve the problem, it muted it. Smothered the screams with a velvet pillow and whispered, "Shh, we'll deal with that tomorrow." For some, that was enough. For others, it was just the beginning of a very long, very blurry journey. You think of the bottle in your own pocket, the sleep lettuce extract from the apothecary earlier, and feel oddly grateful that it's just salad water and not something more dangerous. Your thoughts may still spin, your feet may still wander, but at least you're present. Awake. Real. And really, in a city where everyone's dreaming in tinctures and tonics, there's something oddly heroic about not sleeping too easily. Your pace slows now, not from weariness, but from a subtle shift in atmosphere. The night has deepened. Sounds are muted. London itself seems to have taken a breath and decided to hold it. The streets are no longer merely quiet. They're reverent, like a museum after closing time. It's the perfect hour to talk about the silent villains of Victorian sleeplessness, the beds themselves. If you've ever thought, I bet a feather mattress, an embroidered canopy would be dreamy, think again. Because while the Victorians were experts in aesthetic coziness, actual comfort was another story. And often that story involved lumpy stuffing, strange materials, and a surprising amount of horsehair. Let's start with the basics. Most middle-class folks slept on a structure called a bedstead, typically made of heavy wood or iron. It looked impressive. Ornate carvings, sturdy frame, maybe even a four-poster setup. But the mattress was where things got dicey. You settle onto a stoop for a moment, imagining the average Victorian sleeper wrestling with their bedding like a villain in a Dickensian wrestling match. First came the palliasse, a straw-filled base that rustled with every breath. Then, if you were lucky, a second layer stuffed with wool, horsehair, or flock, shredded rags, essentially. Soft, occasionally. Consistent, never. One side might sink like quicksand, while the other popped up like a reluctant souffle. Historians still argue whether these beds actually improved sleep or just made people nostalgic for sitting upright in armchairs. Some claim the uneven surfaces forced the body into awkward positions, especially for women wearing corsets to bed, which, yes, was a thing. Others say the scratchy textures gave your skin a light exfoliation while you dreamed of smoother times. If you were wealthy, you might spring for a feather bed. Luxurious, yes, but they came with issues of their own. The feathers had a habit of shifting, creating goose-down dunes that left your spine in peril. Also, mites. So many mites. The 19th century bed was less a sleeping surface and more a bustling biosphere. You rise again, walking now toward the flickering glow of a gas lamp, its hissing flame the only witness to your thoughts. The path curves alongside a narrow mews where servants once slept, on thinner mattresses, often stuffed with straw, and laid across rope-strung frames. The ropes had to be tightened regularly, giving rise to the saying, "sleep tight," a charming euphemism for don't fall into the abyss when your bed collapses. For those with backaches or peculiar ideas about circulation, there were even waterbeds. Yes, the Victorians had waterbeds, though the design resembled a leaky bladder more than the sleek pods of the 1970s. You'd lie atop a large rubber sack filled with warm water, heated by the fire if you were lucky, and hope it didn't rupture mid-slumber. There's a reason they didn't catch on. Then there were the pillows, often overstuffed to the point of resembling small ottomans. If you managed to wedge your head into a semi-breathable position, you'd still be confronted with lace edging, wool ticking, and the faint scent of lavender sachets soaked in kerosene. Some households even used pillows made of cork granules for spinal support, which sounds less like bedtime and more like a low-stakes medieval punishment. A passing carriage rattles by in the distance, and you imagine someone in its plush back seat trying to nap after a ball, their head lolling against a velvet curtain while their stomach churns from the punch. They'll get home, collapse into a bed that looks like a royal throne, and wake up feeling like they slept on a pile of tax records. Meanwhile, if you were poor, your sleep arrangements were more improvisational. Many lower-class Londoners shared beds with relatives, strangers, or rats, often all three. Boarding houses might cram 6 adults into a room with one straw mattress and one chamber pot. Sleep wasn't a nightly indulgence, it was a rare communal ceasefire. And yet, for all their discomfort, Victorians had an almost sacred reverence for proper sleep. Entire etiquette books detailed how one should prepare for bed. You should wash, but not too thoroughly lest you awaken the senses, don a nightshirt, preferably embroidered, because fashion never sleeps, and pray. Always pray. Preferably while kneeling beside the bed and trying not to notice the mildew creeping along the wall. There were also gendered rules. Women were expected to maintain modesty in sleepwear, no visible ankles, thank you, and never, ever snore. Men, meanwhile, were allowed the occasional sleep grumble, but were judged on how silently they removed their cravat. You reach a park fence now, its wrought iron spikes softened by ivy. Inside, the grass glows silver under moonlight, empty save for a couple of benches and a very determined fox. You lean against the gate, wondering if you'd be more comfortable curling up in the grass than in the average Victorian bed. It's possible, and that's saying something. Of course, not all Victorians suffered. Some grew accustomed to their odd sleeping arrangements, even finding comfort in the ritual, the pulling back of drapes, the tucking in of sheets, the slow sinking into a nest of discomfort softened by routine. Maybe that's the secret, not comfort, but repetition, predictability. The illusion that if you do the same thing every night, sleep will eventually arrive like a well-trained but occasionally tardy servant. You yawn, not entirely for effect. The image of a feather bed doesn't sound quite so absurd anymore. even with the lumps, even with the questionable stuffing, because at this hour, any bed sounds like a gift. And that, perhaps, is what the Victorians understood better than we give them credit for. That sleep is not always about luxury, or science, or even peace. Sometimes it's just about the willingness to lie still and wait. The fox disappears into the hedges and you push off the gate with a soft creak. Onward, through the hush of Victorian London, where each gas lamp flickers like it's part of some grand bedtime symphony conducted in yawns and slippered footsteps. You're heading now toward a more domestic stretch of townhouses, cozy, respectable places. The kind with lace curtains, polished knockers, and flower boxes that somehow even look sleepy at this hour. You pause by one and imagine what's going on inside. Because while laudanum, lettuce tea, and bizarre bedding played their parts, the real action of Victorian sleep took place within a tangled ritual of nighttime routines. And you, lucky you, are about to experience one. Let's begin with the grand undressing. By modern standards, you'd be out of your day clothes in 5 seconds flat. But a Victorian bedtime? That was a production. First, your boots. They must come off with a boot jack, unless you've got a maid or valet nearby, in which case they're crouched patiently at your feet like a weary foot removal butler. Next, the corset, if you're wearing one. Unlaced with care and occasional grunting, it flops to the side like a defeated accordion. Then come the petticoats, the camise, the garters, the underskirts. Honestly, at this point, you've burned more calories undressing than you did during your evening health walk. Historians still argue whether Victorian nighttime dress codes were designed for hygiene, morality, or simply to confuse burglars. Probably all three, because once you're stripped of your public self, you begin layering on your private armor, your nightshirt, unflattering, your nightcap, absurd, and if you're of a certain age or disposition, your bed socks. These weren't fuzzy spa day things either. They were knitted woolen contraptions with the approximate comfort level of a damp sandwich. You're walking now past a townhouse where a lamp still burns in an upstairs window. Maybe someone's still in the mirror stage of the routine, gazing at themselves in a dim oval mirror, applying cold cream in a ghostly smudge, and trying not to cry about the fact that their skin regime includes actual arsenic. Yes, arsenic. Don't worry, it wasn't always fatal. Some used diluted versions as beauty treatments, others as a mild sedative, still others in trace amounts as a nerve tonic taken just before bed. Victorians had a deeply flexible definition of what counted as relaxing. You pass a small secondhand bookshop where an old ledger in the window reads, "How to Sleep Better, A Lady's Guide, 1858. You suspect it doesn't include any advice about screen time or cutting caffeine. Instead, it likely lists helpful reminders such as avoid vigorous thought, decline all late-night letter writing, and pray until your brain forgets to stay awake. Inside many homes, the bedroom had become a sacred chamber of nightly rituals. Some families insisted on a chapter from the Bible before bed. Others recited poetry. One famously eccentric London lawyer reportedly read the same 4 pages of Robinson Crusoe every night. Not because he liked them, but because they were so boring, they guaranteed sleep. You drift now toward the Thames, where the water glints like spilled mercury. A light breeze curls around your collar as you picture a household winding down for the night. Candles extinguished with a tidy hiss. Windows shut against the fog. Bed warmers slipped between the sheets. Those curious little pans filled with hot coals and swung like sleepy pendulums until the linen stopped feeling like refrigerated cloth. Of course, not everyone had such gentle rituals. Servants often stayed up hours later than their employers, cleaning chamber pots, stoking fires, preparing breakfast trays in advance. For them, sleep was not a ceremony. It was a corner of the pantry floor, a pile of spare linens, a few hours when no one needed anything. Meanwhile, in middle-class households, one spouse might already be snoring while the other tried every trick in the book, counting backwards by sevens, folding handkerchiefs to a metronomic rhythm, or holding a cold spoon against their wrist, something a sleep manual from 1872 insists soothes the pulse. Historians still argue whether these routines were rooted in science, superstition, or sheer desperation. Likely a cocktail of all three. But they do agree on one thing. Bedtime was never casual. It was a solemn pact between body and mind, A bargain struck in the dim hour when everything slows and the brain tries to forgive the day. You reach a quiet bench near the river, where the stone is cold but surprisingly welcome. Above you, stars glint like stray pins from a lady's lost hat. Somewhere, a distant clock chimes the hour, soft, resigned, as if even time itself is tired. And still, many across the city lie awake. Some stare at ceilings, some recite Psalm 23, some ponder letters they never sent, dreams they never chased, cakes they never baked, and some, like you, walk the streets in imagined silk slippers, searching for rest in the rhythm of memory. The routines, for all their fuss and folklore, weren't always successful, but they gave structure to the silence, anchored the mind in predictability, gave the illusion of control in a world full of coal smoke and existential dread, and sometimes that illusion was enough. The bench is too cold to stay long, even in imagination. You rise, stretch your legs, and meander east toward a cluster of flickering street lamps. Their glow spills across cobblestones like melted butter on toast, except the toast smells faintly of horse dung, chimney soot, and something unidentifiably damp. Your nose wrinkles. Time to shift focus. We've undressed, uncorked the laudanum, and fluffed the world's lumpiest featherbed. But what if none of it works? What if, even after counting backwards by sevens and listening to your neighbor's son practice the cornet through a shared wall, you're still wide awake? Well then, my sleepless friend, it's time for the ultimate Victorian sleep move, the midnight walk. Yes, the Victorians were big believers in walking it off, whether it was indigestion, heartbreak, or chronic insomnia. Doctors often prescribed long, slow strolls through the city as a natural sedative, and not in the cozy, quick loop around the block in your fleece robe kind of way. We're talking serious mileage here. Some recommended 2 to 3 miles of gentle perambulation before attempting sleep. You turn down a narrow side street, half imagining the silhouettes of other midnight walkers drifting along with you, shapeless figures in shawls and topcoats, all bound by the same unspoken agreement. Don't speak. Don't hurry. Just walk until your thoughts forget to think. Historians still argue whether these strolls were actually effective or just gave the illusion of progress. After all, if you're out in the fog for an hour and come home yawning, did the fresh air cure your insomnia, or just exhaust you into submission? There were rules, of course. This was still Victorian England after all. Ladies were advised to remain indoors unless chaperoned or disguised as respectable widows. Men could wander more freely, though even they were expected to maintain decorum. Hands clasped behind back, eyes respectfully downcast, no sudden sprints unless chased by a stray goose. And these weren't just walks. They were intentional. Some treated them as a form of meditation, pacing slowly in a straight line down hallways or gardens, repeating calming phrases like, "Sleep is a blessing," or more cryptically, "The brain must cool." Others made a kind of art out of their routes, around the block once clockwise, then counterclockwise, past the bakery, loop by the cemetery, back to the front stoop. One man reportedly traced the shape of Queen Victoria's profile using London streets as his canvas. He was very tired. As you pass a quiet alley, you spot a candle still burning behind a curtain. Someone else is awake. Maybe it's a poet staring at their ceiling, or a mother with a teething baby, or a retired colonel trying to remember where he left his pipe. Sleeplessness, it turns out, is the great equalizer. Aristocrat or chimney sweep, when the body rebels, you all take the same midnight pilgrimage. And while these nocturnal walks may sound quaint, they were also deeply practical. Without electric lights, cities were quieter, darker, and oddly peaceful after midnight. The clatter of daytime vanished. The gossip of shopkeepers faded into soft echoes. There were fewer distractions. No Twitter, no light pollution. Just the shuffle of boots and the occasional good evening exchanged like a secret handshake among the tired. One fringe remedy from a home guide in 1883 suggested this: tie a ribbon around your wrist before walking. If you haven't fallen asleep within 2 hours of returning home, switch the ribbon to the other wrist. If that doesn't work, cease to struggle, for surely rest will claim you at last. It's either wisdom or surrender. Hard to say. You find yourself passing a bakery now, closed, but the yeasty warmth still hangs in the air. You stop, take a long, slow breath, and wonder how many other insomniacs have stood here over the centuries craving both sleep and pastries, likely thousands. And then, something surprising. There were, in fact, entire societies of sleepless people. Not formal clubs exactly, but loose networks of acquaintances who bumped into each other night after night. The man who swept the streets with suspicious enthusiasm. The widow who walked in circles muttering about fig jam. The out-of-work actor who recited Hamlet to cats. Familiar figures. Gentle nods passed like currency. And if you couldn't walk, you improvised. A common trick was to rearrange furniture. Nothing major, just nudging the chaise slightly left or adjusting a side table. The theory was that small physical movements could settle an overactive mind, or at least distract it. Historians still argue whether this was a clever tactic or just an elaborate way to justify insomnia-induced redecorating. You make a right turn now, heading toward a narrow garden path overgrown with lavender. The scent is calming, and no wonder. Victorians adored lavender for sleep. They stuffed it into pillows, rubbed its oil on temples, and hung bundles near bedposts like sleepy talismans. Some even stirred it into warm milk or mashed it with sugar into little lozenges known as dream drops. And if lavender failed, try orange blossom water, or vinegar foot baths, or hot bricks wrapped in flannel placed gently at your feet. If your insomnia persisted after that, then clearly you were cursed and should consider spiritual reevaluation. But walking was democratic. It required no potions, no servants, no expensive doctors, just you, your thoughts, and the soothing rhythm of one foot in front of the other, which, as you walk now, starts to feel familiar. Soothing even, like the body remembering something it never forgot, like a lullaby with shoe leather. You glance up. The stars have shifted slightly, the fog is thinner, and somewhere in one of these houses, someone just yawned. Deep, honest, contagious. You keep walking. The cobblestones give way to a soft gravel path, and the click of your footsteps mutes to a crunch. You're somewhere near the edge of a square now, one of those hidden green pockets tucked into the city like a sigh. Iron railings, climbing roses, and a public bench that looks like it's hosted generations of pigeons and secret smokers. This, you realize, is where some of the more creative Victorian sleep theories were born. Not from science, but from simple observation and a generous amount of hopeful guesswork. And tonight, you're going to test a few of them. Let's start with bed positioning. Not the kind involving expensive feng shui consultations, but something more anatomically Victorian. A well-thumbed household manual from 1861 advised that a bed should face exactly east, allowing the rising sun to gently beckon the slumbering soul. Historians still argue whether this had anything to do with sunlight or was just a poetic excuse to rearrange furniture. The same guide warned against sleeping with your feet pointing directly at the door. Something about death, bad spirits, and possibly a borrowed superstition from multiple cultures. You pause near a bench, wiggle your toes in your boots, and wonder if they're currently aligned with any ghostly portals. Just to be safe, you pivot 30 degrees. There, that's better. Victorians were also suspicious of mirrors in the bedroom. Reflections, they believed, could trap your soul mid-sleep or invite unwanted spiritual eavesdroppers. So the solution? Drape a cloth over the mirror at night, preferably lace or muslin, something both ethereal and deeply flammable. And while we're on nighttime threats, let's not forget the humble draft, enemy number one of the anxious Victorian sleeper. Drafts, you see, weren't just a chill breeze. They were suspected carriers of everything from colds to melancholy. The presence of even a modest cross breeze was enough to send some Victorians diving beneath eiderdowns like panicked marmots. Windows were sealed tight, gaps stuffed with fabric sausages, and beds were often draped in heavy curtains to fend off air movement and nosy spirits. You keep walking and pass a grand townhouse, its windows dark, but its architecture still radiating old wealth. Imagine sleeping inside that, beneath a canopy bed with velvet hangings, in a room wallpapered with birds, beside a fireplace quietly hissing its last embers. Luxurious, yes, but also complicated. Because even in the fanciest bedrooms, sleep wasn't guaranteed. Some upper-class Victorians developed what one writer called somnolent anxiety of the polite classes, a tendency to overthink their own sleep habits. These were the folks who hired sleep tutors, yes, real thing, collected imported herbs, and kept diaries of their dreams like they were cataloging butterflies. One particularly dedicated gentleman wrote nightly pre-sleep reports in which he detailed every sensation from the temperature of his bedpan to the angle of his big toe. He never once reported sleeping well. You suspect he was too busy taking notes. And it wasn't just adults. Victorian children were subjected to rigid sleep routines from birth. Nannies were instructed to whisper lullabies in Latin. Cribs were lined with horsehair for firmness of spine. And God help the toddler who asked for a drink of water after being tucked in. That was considered a moral failing and possibly a sign of future criminal behavior. You reach a fountain in the center of the square. It's dry now, the stone bowl chipped and mossy. You sit, running your fingers along its cold rim. You imagine an insomniac from 1874 sitting here before you, notebook in hand, watching the moon ripple in the water, scribbling something like, "Tried sleeping with socks inside out. Still awake. Suspect brain is possessed. Will pray. Again." And speaking of prayer, faith, too, played its role in the Victorian night. Many swore by evening psalms or whispered recitations of, "Now I lay me down to sleep," but others turned to stranger rituals. One elderly woman reportedly kept a sliver of St. Cuthbert's bone under her pillow to ward off bad dreams. Whether it worked is unknown. What's certain is that it made changing the bed linens very awkward. Then there were those who looked to technology, or at least the 19th century version of it. Enter the clock pillow. This odd invention involved a small ticking mechanism sewn into a pillowcase. The idea was that the steady tick-tick would lull you like a mother's heartbeat. Of course, it also sometimes exploded, but you can't have everything. A quieter alternative? The sleep harmonium. A musical device set to emit gentle tones for an hour, then shut off. Early models didn't shut off and had to be muffled with socks. Historians still argue whether these devices worked or just annoyed everyone into unconsciousness. Back on your feet, you take one final lap around the square. Lavender again, soft on the breeze. The windows are mostly dark now. Even the foxes are napping. It's just you, the moon, and your imaginary corset, which you removed 2 chapters ago, thank goodness. The truth, as you're starting to realize, is that sleep wasn't simple in the Victorian era. It wasn't just a passive state. It was a full-time performance. An opera of rituals, beliefs, tinctures, and timing. Some scientific, some spiritual, and some so absurd you'd think they were invented by a sleepy raccoon. But every night, regardless of class, creed, or confusion, millions tried. They fluffed, sipped, walked, prayed, rearranged, and waited. Just like you are now. And maybe, just maybe, one of them finally nodded off here, right where you're standing. Lucky them. The gravel shifts under your heel as you step away from the dry fountain. A cat, possibly named something like Mr. Whiskers o' Sleep Bay III, darts across your path and disappears into a hedge with aristocratic disdain. You continue on, half expecting him to reemerge in a top hat. Now, let's turn to one of the most peculiar and endearingly strange sleep theories of the Victorian age: digestive dreaming. Yes, you're entering the slightly crumb-strewn world of Victorian bedtime diets, where the line between sleep remedy and mild gastrointestinal rebellion was perilously thin. You pass a gas lamp glowing like a sleepy eye and pause to consider your evening menu. Because according to 19th century common wisdom, what you ate before bed determined what kind of dreams you'd have and whether you'd sleep at all. Let's start with the classic, lettuce. Before it became the sad base of every awkward office lunch, lettuce was hailed as a natural sedative. Victorians believed its white sap, called lacticarium, had a soothing, almost opium-like effect. It didn't, not really, unless you consumed 6 heads in a prayer. But this didn't stop anyone from boiling lettuce leaves into watery teas or stuffing them into sandwiches charmingly labeled dream witches. You imagine biting into a limp lettuce sandwich at midnight and thinking, this must be what despair tastes like. Historians still argue whether this lettuce obsession stemmed from Roman herbal texts or was simply the result of a slow news week in the medical journals. Now, if lettuce failed you, and it often did, there was always stewed prunes. Yes, prunes. Rich in fiber and iron, they were thought to soften the system and prevent nighttime restlessness. You don't want to think too hard about what soften the system might mean at 2 a.m., but for some reason, it was believed that an orderly colon meant a peaceful mind. Victorian logic, Always a fun ride. You pass a dimly lit shopfront advertising antique books. Inside, a clerk dozes in a chair, possibly digesting prunes, possibly meditating. Hard to tell. Now for a more elite dish, calf's foot jelly. Not your go-to bedtime snack, perhaps, but in the Victorian age, this wobbly, gelatinous marvel was thought to have nervine properties. It was made by boiling the feet of calves until they released collagen, then letting the goo set with sugar and wine. The result, a jiggly dessert designed to soothe frazzled nerves and possibly traumatize your palate. For the financially blessed, there were imported sleep treats like Turkish figs, French almonds, and something called East India sleep cakes, which may or may not have included nutmeg, cardamom, and the tears of colonial tax collectors. Less fortunate insomniacs often resorted to bread and warm milk, sometimes with cinnamon or rosewater added for harmony. If you were especially desperate, you might stir in a spoonful of brandy, just enough to lull you, not enough to start a tavern brawl in your digestive tract. And then, of course, there was cheese, a deeply divisive bedtime topic. Victorians were split down the middle. Some believed cheese led to disturbed, possibly demonic dreams. Others insisted it comforted the stomach and coddled the mind. Charles Dickens allegedly suffered a particularly vivid nightmare after eating cheddar too close to midnight. Some blamed the cheese. Others suggested it was just Dickens being Dickens. You pause in front of a tall window and see your reflection. Sleepy-eyed, possibly hungry, deeply suspicious of dairy. You tip your hat to yourself and move on. Now, there were other culinary oddities too. One physician in 1879 recommended a raw onion rubbed with sea salt to be nibbled as the sun sets. He claimed it balanced the body's internal temperature and stilled the humors. It's unclear what it did for your breath. Meanwhile, a radical pamphlet titled The Doctrine of Soothing Foods proposed that any food containing rounded edges and gentle textures would promote smoother dreams. The author then described an ideal meal as a small boiled potato and a single peeled pear. You can almost hear the insomniacs of 1882 crying softly into their starches. Some fringe thinkers believed certain foods absorbed nightmares. One woman reportedly placed a buttered biscuit under her pillow each night to trap unpleasant images. No word on whether the biscuit consented. And let's not forget ginger beer. Fizzy, sweet, slightly medicinal. Some used it to calm their nerves before bed. Others drank so much they woke up hiccuping the national anthem. Historians still argue whether ginger truly helped, or if the carbonation just distracted the brain long enough to allow sleep to sneak in. As you pass through a garden gate left ajar, you imagine the sleepy kitchens of 19th century homes. The flicker of oil lamps, the clink of ceramic mugs, the sighs of cooks testing stewed lettuce recipes and wondering what their lives had become. And somewhere among them is you, sleep chasing, slightly full, and starting to understand that the Victorian world was far more obsessed with bedtime than anyone gives it credit for. Every crumb, every sip, every leaf boiled into soggy surrender. It was all part of the ritual. The hope that maybe, tonight, you'd finally drift off. And if not, well, there's always the biscuit under the pillow. You slip out of the garden gate, pausing to let the latch click softly shut. The street ahead is hushed, the lamps glowing in that faint, buttery way gaslight does when no one's watching. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage rolls by, wheels a soft whisper against the cobblestone. It's the kind of night that seems built for sleep. But of course, if you were a Victorian, you'd still be wide awake, trying yet another method. Tonight's focus? Walking it off. The Victorians, as it turns out, were firm believers in the power of the nocturnal stroll. Not exercise for fitness, oh no, that would have been unseemly. This was deliberate, meditative pacing meant to dissolve anxious vapors and soothe the animal spirit. You picture yourself in a tall hat, one hand tucked behind your back, the other holding an emergency biscuit. Dignified, slightly mysterious, and deeply, deeply tired. Doctors at the time prescribed such walks with uncanny specificity. A gentleman suffering from mind chatter might be told to walk precisely 47 minutes through a tree-lined avenue, always turning clockwise at intersections to align the energies. Women were advised to walk only in gardens, ideally those with roses, because roses were thought to cool the blood. You consider how much blood your body must think needs chilling by now. Historians still argue whether these rituals were more psychological placebo than medical practice, but either way, it beat pacing in a dark room worrying about mirror spirits. You step into one such garden path now, moonlight dappling the dirt, hedges neatly clipped as if trimmed by an insomniac ghost with excellent taste. These paths, often built around stately homes or sanatoriums, were known as lunacy loops, serene circuits for restless patients to walk under the moon. The idea being that nature, repetition, and a decent coat could cure even the most troubled sleeper. But not all walks were serene. Some Victorians, especially those in more scientific households, practiced something called stimulus inversion. The theory? If your insomnia was caused by a racing mind, then you must bore it into submission. You'd walk slowly in a circle, reciting the most tedious facts you could recall: shipping weights, tax codes, botanical classifications of mosses. Anything to gently stun the brain into surrender. You try it now, muttering, kingdom plantae, division bryophyta, spore dispersal via elaters. Still awake, but you are kind of impressed by your moss knowledge. Somewhere along the curve of the path, you find a bench beneath a beech tree. It creaks slightly as you sit, but holds your weight like an old friend. You picture a Victorian clergyman sitting here too, legs crossed at the ankle, top hat tilted low. He's on his 6th lap, having tried warm ale, cold compresses, 2 psalms, and a lettuce poultice to no avail. Now he walks, and walks, and walks. His doctor probably advised it in Latin. By the 1880s, sleep clinics began recommending structured perambulations. Yes, that's the term. A chart might show the ideal loop to walk based on your melancholia level. The more despondent, the smaller the loop, as if spatial constraint would rein in emotional excess. You wonder if this actually worked, or if it was just a clever way to keep people from wandering into traffic. Children, too, were encouraged to walk pre-sleep, but gently, always gently. Nurses believed rambunctious frolicking after supper led to vivid dreams of crocodiles and, somehow, socialism. You stroll forward, arms folded behind your back in a gesture that feels pleasantly Victorian. The breeze is cool now, scented with damp earth and distant coal smoke. A cat stares at you from atop a wall, possibly the same cat from before, possibly reincarnated as a moral judge. You nod. For those in rural areas, the bedtime walk was sometimes replaced with hedge leaning. That is, standing quietly against a hedgerow and watching the stars until your mind settled. There were even hedge diaries where people recorded the thoughts that came to them during this meditative plant conference. Sample entry: leant against elderberry, felt at peace, saw a mole. Named him Clarence, still tired. Others took their walks indoors, especially in bad weather. Long hallways were prized, circular parlors even better. One wealthy widow allegedly had a walking track built around her drawing room just for sleep pacing. A servant followed silently with a tray of boiled sweets and anxiety tonics. And still, even after all that effort, sleep could remain elusive, which is how you get to the next Victorian strategy: faking it till you make it. That's right. Pretend you're asleep until your body gets the hint. This involved lying absolutely still, often in death pose, with arms folded and no pillow. One sleep manual claimed, if you lay as still as the grave, slumber will think you dead and sneak in unnoticed. Charming. You try it now, sitting still as stone on your bench, limbs relaxed, face soft. You imagine a crow watching you from a lamppost, confused by your serenity. You try to feel like a sleeping person. You begin to almost believe you are. And that, really, was the Victorian genius. All their strange methods, their peculiar pacing, and hopeful salads, they were all about belief. That if you tried hard enough, followed the right ritual, read the right pamphlet, walked the correct number of garden loops, you'd earn your sleep. Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't, but at least you'd get a nice stroll out of it. Awaiting continue. The bench sighs gently beneath you as you rise, your knees creaking just enough to remind you that perhaps the walking cure comes at the cost of joint durability. But onward you go, deeper into the sleepy mystery of Victorian sleep solutions. This time, your path leads through a narrower alleyway, cobbled and crooked, where the gas lamps sputter like they too could use a nap. Now let's talk about one of the more peculiar avenues of Victorian bedtime science: sleep postures and bedroom geometry. Yes, dear insomniac wanderer, Tonight we're aligning your spine, your compass, and possibly your karma. Victorians had opinions, with a capital O, on how exactly one ought to lie down in bed. You didn't just flop in and hope for the best. You became a human sundial of slumber. Let's begin with orientation. Many Victorian manuals insisted you sleep with your head pointing due north. This wasn't just a quirky superstition, it was a serious recommendation grounded in magnetism theory. The belief was that your body, like a compass needle, would align better with the Earth's magnetic field if you slept north-south, thus allowing your brainwaves to flow freely. Historians still argue whether this came from pseudoscientific German treatises or just one guy named Neville who owned a compass and wouldn't shut up about it. Either way, bedrooms were rearranged. Bed frames moved. People slept diagonally across the room like confused starfish, and if you couldn't position your bed north-south, some advised sleeping sitting up, facing northeast, while clutching a polished stone. Naturally, you pass a wrought iron gate covered in ivy, and it rattles slightly as if disturbed by the mention of Neville. Next up, pillow theory. Victorians were weirdly obsessed with the shape, number, and firmness of pillows. Soft feather pillows were considered dangerously indulgent. They were thought to coddle the brain, leading to frivolous dreams and an overactive imagination. If you had a strong creative streak, it might have been blamed on down pillows. You, sir, were a victim of fluff. Harder pillows, sometimes filled with straw or even rice, were preferred by Stoics and the devout. A hard pillow for a soft conscience, one particularly judgy preacher wrote. Others simply stuffed their pillows with lavender sprigs or hops, anything to add a gentle aroma of acceptable drowsiness. You imagine a room full of Victorians whacking each other with various sleep-approved cushions, arguing over firmness ratios. And then there's the ultimate sleep pose, the repose of moral certainty. This was described in an 1863 guide as lying flat on your back, arms folded gently across your chest, chin slightly tilted upward toward divine rest. It was essentially Victorian corpse cosplay. You looked like you'd just been painted by a pre-Raphaelite and left on display. And if that didn't work, curl up on your right side, never the left. The left side was thought to provoke vivid dreams, indigestion, and nocturnal whisperings from one's baser nature. The right side, by contrast, was associated with purity, calm, and orderly breathing. You suspect it also had something to do with being easier for the average snoring husband to ignore. Inside these tidy bedrooms, every object played a part. Your bed curtains, for example, weren't just decorative, they were functional noise buffers and dream regulators. Heavy brocade was said to promote deeper sleep, while lighter muslins invited ethereal dreams. A doctor once claimed that satin-lined curtains invite dreams of success, but linen brings clarity. You're beginning to suspect he was just trying to sell more fabric. You enter a small square framed by houses with candlelit windows. One flickers out just as you look up. Somewhere inside, a tired Victorian is probably adjusting their pillow, turning to the right, and mentally reciting latitude lines to ease into unconsciousness. Now, let's not forget temperature control. Bed chambers, ideally, should be brisk but not bracing. That's right, your room must be cold enough to feel virtuous, but not so cold that you cry. Window cracking was encouraged to ensure vital air turnover, though many also feared nighttime drafts would lead to brain chill. You know, the classic 1800s diagnosis, madness via night breeze. So naturally, people covered their heads in sleeping caps, long, silly, and entirely serious. Some were lined with fleece or flannel, others had pouches for herbs, a few even included built-in earplugs made from beeswax and virtue. The goal, warmth without hysteria, drowsiness without danger. Then there were sleeping gowns, which came with detailed warnings. Too tight and you'd strangle your dreams. Too loose and the draughts would whisk your soul into the fireplace. The perfect gown was breathable, cotton, and preferably hand-embroidered with something vaguely poetic, like a sparrow, or the word soothe. By the time you reach the end of the alley, you half expect someone to hand you a perfectly balanced pillow and a temperature-controlled nightgown as a congratulatory prize. But instead, you just pause, take in the scene. Imagine a Victorian household going through its elaborate bedtime ritual. Bed turned northward, pillows fluffed to moral specifications, nightcaps donned like battle helmets. A symphony of sighs, creaking bedposts, and whispered prayers for a dreamless night. And somehow, despite all the quirks and complications, they believed it would work. They believed that if you faced the right direction, wore the right clothes, and breathed just the right way, you could make sleep obey. It's hard not to admire the optimism. The cobblestone path gently turns beneath your feet as if steering you toward your next bedtime curiosity, one that is, quite literally, bottled. You've walked, you've aligned with the Earth's magnetic field, you've fluffed morally upright pillows. Now it's time to talk about what the Victorians drank before bed. And oh dear listener, you'd better be thirsty. Tonight, we sip our way through the oddly soothing and occasionally alarming world of Victorian sleep tonics and beverages. First up, lettuce water. Yes, we're back to lettuce. You may remember our salad sedative from earlier, but this time it's liquid. A delicate infusion of boiled lettuce leaves, allowed to steep until the water turns an ominous shade of swamp optimism. This was sipped slowly from a porcelain cup while sitting next to a ticking mantel clock and trying very hard not to gag. The theory behind this quaint concoction came from the idea that lettuce, a plant of the opium family, contains minute traces of lactucarium, a white, bitter substance secreted by certain varieties when cut. Naturally, someone decided this meant it could knock you out like a Dickensian sleeping spell. Historians still argue whether there was enough active compound in a cup to affect anything besides your patience. But lettuce was just the leafy beginning. More refined households turned to tonics, often crafted by apothecaries with ingredients that sound like they belong on a potion label: valerian root, skullcap, hops, and the ever-popular laudanum. That's right, we've arrived at our old dangerous friend. Laudanum was, essentially, opium dissolved in alcohol. Equal parts Victorian elegance and future lawsuits. Sold over the counter in tiny glass bottles, it was marketed as everything from a sleep aid to a cure for nerves, hysteria, minor marital disagreements, and occasionally the burden of consciousness. You sip an imaginary dose now, feel the warmth slide down your spine. Or maybe that's just your modern nervous system recoiling in horror. Children, too, were given diluted versions of these potions, often disguised with treacle or peppermint. A popular brand was Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, which promised to calm teething babies and conveniently failed to mention it contained morphine. Sweet dreams, little Harold. But not every tonic was a ticket to the opium den. There were gentler alternatives, posset milk, for instance. A warm drink made of milk, ale, nutmeg, and sometimes bread soaked in the mixture like a sleepy medieval cereal. The texture? Let's just say, wet sponge with dreams of soup. But it was comfort food. It warmed the belly. It made you feel, if nothing else, like someone's concerned great-aunt was nearby. Another popular pre-bed potion was gruel. Yes, gruel. That same sad porridge you associate with Oliver Twist was considered a luxury if infused with a spoonful of sherry and grated lemon peel. It was said to lay the stomach like a warm poultice. Victorian medical poetry right there. You walk by a tiny tea shop now, shuttered for the night, but you can almost hear the tinkle of porcelain and the hiss of boiling kettles. The Victorians didn't just drink to sleep, they ritualized it. There were sleep teas, hand-blended from chamomile, fennel, thyme, and moon-touched mint. Not just regular mint. No, moon-touched. The label guaranteed it had been picked only after dusk by hands that believed. And if teas failed, there was warm ale. Often spiced with cloves or ginger, this mellow beverage acted as a social sedative. Men drank it by the fireplace, musing about the empire and whether socks were a luxury or a necessity. Women sipped it quietly upstairs, possibly while avoiding their fourth child and mentally reviewing embroidery patterns. Of course, no discussion of bedtime beverages would be complete without hot wine punch. Yes, the Victorians essentially drank alcoholic soup before bed. Red wine, sugar, nutmeg, citrus peel, heated gently until it shimmered with the promise of sleep and probable indigestion. One clergyman wrote in his diary, "Took my wine punch and fell asleep before the second hymn. Blessed." Not everyone drank, though. Some abstainers turned to hydrotherapy, but internally. That meant slowly sipping cold water just before bed. 3 sips, no more, no less. It was believed to quieten the liver and trick the mind into believing it has done something. You admire that level of psychological finesse, hydration as gaslighting. Still, the showstopper beverage among upper-crust insomniacs was a rather decadent concoction known as the Royal Slumber Cordial. It featured egg yolk, sherry, nutmeg, cinnamon, and a dash of gold leaf. Gold leaf, because nothing says bedtime like drinking wealth. You imagine Queen Victoria herself swirling a goblet and whispering, "Sleep, but make it fancy." Yet for all these drinks, sweet, bitter, warm, spiced, the goal was always the same: to comfort, to cradle the restless in something familiar, even if that something tasted like old shoe polish filtered through a tea bag. You stop at a little stone fountain now, its water bubbling like a lullaby for pigeons. A perfect place to imagine the final bedtime drink of the night. Nothing. Just silence, breath, maybe a memory of posset milk, and the soft rustle of bed curtains. Because sometimes, despite all the tinctures and tonics, all the theories and thermometers, the best thing for sleep was surrender. And in that moment, surrounded by echoes of past rituals, you almost believe you could fall asleep right here, standing up, between a posset and a prayer. You walk a little slower now, not out of fatigue necessarily, but because the air feels thicker, like you're wading through the residue of dreams. The sort of late-night heaviness that makes even the most ridiculous ideas, like drinking lettuce broth or aligning your bed to magnetic poles, seem perfectly reasonable. In this murky mood, let's follow the flickering trail to the most unconventional of all Victorian sleep strategies: hypnosis, magnets, and midnight self-discipline. Yes, dear sleep seeker, we've officially entered the experimental wing of Victorian bedtime. Here the rules are softer, the ideas wilder, and the success rate, let's call it politely anecdotal. Let's begin with mesmerism. A concept so hazy it practically floats. Franz Anton Mesmer, though technically pre-Victorian, left behind a legacy that fully blossomed in 19th century drawing rooms and nerve clinics. The premise? That an invisible, flowing energy, animal magnetism, could be directed by one person to influence another's physical and mental state, including, you guessed it, sleep. You imagine a velvet-draped room, heavy with sandalwood and secrecy. A mesmerist, probably named something like Reginald or Florence, slowly waving their hand in front of a patient's glassy eyes, whispering something gentle like, "You are sleepy. You are very sleepy, and you also owe me 3 shillings." This wasn't fringe science. It had a moment of true popularity. Mesmerists were hired to treat insomnia, anxiety, and a host of other ailments that modern people now refer to as existence. They used pendulums, candle flames, and elaborate gestures that looked like someone doing interpretive jazz hands for Morpheus, the god of dreams. Historians still argue whether it was suggestion, boredom, or sheer exhaustion that sent patients to sleep. Either way, it worked, occasionally. A small park opens ahead, ringed by ancient yews, their trunks thick like twisted ropes. You take a seat on a bench carved with the name Lady Grenville and reflect. What would she have thought about magnetic mattresses? Because yes, magnets were next. Victorian electro-health fanatics believed that magnetic currents could realign the body's natural vibrations, much like tuning a violin string. Only the violin is your spleen, and the string is somewhere near your pancreas. Magnetic bed frames, magnetic rings, magnetic insoles. People went to sleep wearing so many ferromagnetic trinkets they probably stuck to the bed. The most devoted wore magnetic skull caps, which supposedly drew fatigue up and out of the cranium. Others placed lodestones under their pillows. One hopeful gentleman even patented a self-rotating magnetic headboard, which slowly turned you during the night to expose all sides of the brain to healing fields. Spoiler, it didn't work, but it made for excellent anecdotes. As the path winds past the statue of a very sleepy-looking general, we encounter the final, perhaps most ambitious strategy: self-discipline through logbooks. That's right, some Victorians tried to out-organize their insomnia. Enter the sleep diary, a fashionable tool of the well-educated and highly neurotic. These diaries tracked bedtimes, wake times, meal hours, emotional disturbances, and even dream tone. Yes, you'd grade your dreams. A vivid dream of horses might be a 7. A nightmare involving your Latin tutor? That's a 3.5 with a note to avoid pickled onions at supper. Entire families participated. One surviving sleep log from 1882 included separate columns for husband's tossing, dog-related awakenings, and spousal snoring, volume rating. It reads more like a passive-aggressive marital scoreboard than a medical document. Still, there was method in this madness. Many doctors believed that insomnia was a product of mental turbulence, thoughts whipping around like a hurricane in your skull. The cure? Routine, dullness, repetition, and the firm belief that you could schedule your brain like a train timetable. Victorian homes with the budget and moral fortitude installed clock chimes to mark every quarter hour through the night, so if you woke up at 2:45 a.m., you'd know exactly how far from dawn you still were. You weren't just sleepless, you were sleepless with precision. This obsession with mental order sometimes extended into the absurd. One method encouraged insomniacs to recite the names of English counties alphabetically while slowly counting backward from 500. In another, you were told to imagine yourself floating on a cloud, but only if that cloud adhered to Newtonian physics. And if even that failed? Some doctors proposed keeping a small mirror beside the bed. Not for vanity, no, but so you could catch a glimpse of your own wearied eyes and feel compelled by pity to sleep. Imagine that. Staring at your reflection at 3:12 a.m., whispering, "You poor hollow raccoon, just go down." You chuckle under your breath and glance upward. The sky has deepened to navy blue, tinged with lavender, a color the Victorians might have called evening melancholy or the shade of poetry's yawn. Still, for all their oddities, you can't help but appreciate the intention behind these sleep strategies. They weren't all rooted in science, but most were rooted in care, in a genuine desire to make the human condition a little more bearable after sundown. Even the magnetic headboard guy probably just wanted a good night's rest. And now, as the path gently circles back toward the imagined bedroom of your dreams, you wonder, what part of you still believes, just a little, that a warm glass of lettuce water, a whispering mesmerist, or a pillow pointed toward Polaris might finally do the trick? The road narrows now, edging past a low iron gate and into what looks like the back garden of some long-forgotten Victorian townhouse. You can almost hear the soft crunch of your shoes against gravel, the scent of lavender floating from a sleepy hedge, and the faint creak of an old porch swing moved only by wind or memory. This is the final stop, and it's not a tonic or a theory or a gently humming skullcap. No, tonight we end with the ritual of sleep itself. The little ceremonies and deeply peculiar habits that Victorians practiced nightly, not because they were effective, but because they felt like the right thing to do. You've probably done a few of them yourself. Brush your teeth, adjust your pillow, mutter a desperate promise to sleep earlier tomorrow. But Victorians, they took it further. Let's begin with the bedroom itself. A proper Victorian bedroom wasn't just a place to collapse. It was a carefully curated sleep theater. Curtains were thick, often lined with wool to block out moonlight and street lamp gaslight. Walls were painted soft, muted colors like dust rose or faded willow. No bright tones allowed. Those were for the morally reckless. At the center of it all sat the bed, towering, carved, and piled high with mattresses stuffed with horsehair, down, or occasionally seaweed. You'd climb in like a mountaineer and arrange yourself somewhere between comfortably snug and buried alive. Some people, particularly in colder homes, warmed the sheets with bedpans full of embers, carefully slid between the covers before lying down. Others used ceramic hot water pigs, adorably named but suspiciously easy to kick in your sleep. Once in bed, the rituals continued. Some would pray, of course, but others preferred recitations, not of psalms, but of poetry, or even grocery lists. Anything rhythmic. One woman reportedly recited the full names of every British monarch backward until she nodded off around Richard II. Clothing mattered too. Nightshirts were long and billowing, designed to trap warmth and modesty simultaneously. Women wore caps to protect their hairstyles and preserve the curls they spent hours constructing. And yes, some men wore beard protectors, little cotton contraptions that tied under the chin like a child's party hat, but far sadder. Then came the matter of positioning. The consensus was clear: sleep on your right side to avoid compressing the heart. Sleep on your back, and you were inviting sin, or at the very least, indigestion. And as we've mentioned before, never, under any circumstances, point your head north, unless you enjoyed inviting ghosts or upsetting your spleen. By now, you're deeply nestled in a featherbed of imagination. But we're not quite done. Some Victorians kept small bedside journals to record their last thoughts before sleep, poetic musings, prayers, even passive-aggressive entries like, "Martha snored again." A pity. These dream diaries often reflected hopes that one's soul might wander during sleep and gather inspiration from the ether. Victorian dreaming wasn't idle. It was a cosmic networking event. Others avoided dreaming altogether, believing it allowed spirits to visit or sins to replay. One newspaper warned that sleeping in the same room where someone had recently died could allow their final dream to enter your own. Which makes you think twice about that Airbnb with the antique four-poster bed. And then, finally, there were the sounds. Some wanted silence so complete they stuffed their ears with wax. Others welcomed soft noises, the ticking of a clock, the purr of a cat, or, if they could afford it, the distant hum of a wind harp installed on the roof to transform breezes into lullabies. And in the quiet, with all rituals complete, they'd drift off. Or try to. Because the truth was, insomnia rarely bowed to preparation. No matter how many copper wires you wound around your ankles or how long you boiled your lettuce, the human brain remained the same capricious beast it is today, full of thoughts, full of worries, full of far-off futures and never quite finished yesterdays. But that didn't stop them. Every night, the Victorians tried again. With absurd optimism and a deep-seated belief in the power of effort, they tiptoed towards sleep armed with herbal compresses, laudanum laced teas, embroidered nightcaps, and the unshakable conviction that this night, this precise night, might finally be the one. And as you sit there now, warm in your own imagined corner of history, you realize maybe they were onto something. Because even if none of it worked, if the lettuce wilted, the magnets failed, the beard cap strangled, it still offered comfort. Ritual is a lullaby of its own. And somewhere in those feather beds and flannel sheets, 1,000 weary souls were, at the very least, trying to be still. Just like you. Wind down, 300 words. So now the garden fades. The gravel path grows softer beneath your steps, until it's more memory than stone. The yew trees melt into shadow, and the wrought iron gate swings closed behind you, not with a clang, but a sigh. Your breath is slower. You didn't notice it happening, but here it is. That gentle settling of the chest, that quiet between thoughts. The Victorians, with all their wild attempts and soft-spoken hopes, have handed you something unexpected. Not just a list of failed cures, but a slow parade of intention. Every candle lit, every tonic brewed, every bizarre pillow ritual. It was all a gesture, a way of saying, I matter enough to try and rest. And you do too. You let your head lean back now onto nothing in particular. Just the softness of your own willingness to be still. Your ears tuned to silence, or maybe to the faint hum of the fan you forgot was running. Your mind, that loyal night rambler, begins to drift, not toward fear, not toward tasks, but toward clouds shaped like bedpans and dreams flavored faintly of nutmeg. And somewhere far off, in a room lit only by oil lamp, someone is still reading from a sleep journal. Someone else is still rearranging their magnets. Someone's grandparent just poured the last of the lettuce water. But you're already almost there. Inhale. Exhale. You've done enough for one day. You can rest now. End of script. Sweet dreams.